Now that we've created a database and created a table in it and added some data to it, we can get to what makes databases really, really powerful and interesting, and that's the queries. A query is how we get information back out from our table, back out from our database, and we can do it in a way that highlights the information that we're interested in. I've created a slightly more complicated database called Students with Credits, but it's still very simple. It's still got one student's table. That table just has a couple of more pieces of information: the student's major, the number of credits they've taken before this semester, and the number of credits they're enrolled for this semester. And then I've put 10 students in this table. Now this is a really simple, small database to help us see what's going on with our data. But in real life, databases are frequently thousands or millions of rows of data. And those are just average size databases. There are tens of millions or hundreds of millions or beyond that are used regularly in the real world. But 10 items will help us see the data and see what's happening to it when we create a query. To create our query, we'll go to the Create ribbon, and then we could choose Query Wizard, and it would help us get started a little bit with the query, but I'm just going to go straight to Query Design. I think it's a little bit easier to just do that directly. First, we choose what tables do we want to be part of our query. We just have one, but in more complicated databases, there may be hundreds or thousands of tables. We would choose that here. I'm going to click Add to add the table up here, and then close it. Now, when I'm creating a query, there are two main things I'm thinking about. The first thing is, what information do I want from each student? So I might want, for example, the first name of each student and the last name of each student. And by choosing those two items down here at the bottom, and I can either double click them up here at the top, or in the field row here, I can choose them from the drop down. I've said that I would like just the first name and the last name of the students in my table. When I run this query, and I can either click the datasheet view or click the run exclamation point. When I run this query, you'll see I get all 10 students, but I just get their first and last name, not all the information about them. So that's helpful, but that's not really all that powerful. What we really find interesting is being able to say that I only want information about certain students. So I'm going to add their GPA to the query. And I'm going to say down here in the criteria row that the GPA should be greater than 3. And you can always sort of write this in invisibly to the left. So GPA is greater than 3. This will mean I will only get students whose GPA is above 3. And now instead of all 10 students, I just have 3 students. I have their first name, their last name. Now I've added the GPA as a column. And only the 3 students whose GPA is above 3 are showing up here. So far, our query is really not all that helpful. It might have been just as fast to go to the students table and just scroll through and look for the students with a GPA above 3. But you can picture if this table is larger, if there are 1,000 people in this table or 1,000,000 people in this table, that gets really complicated. And our query is just as simple no matter how many pieces of information are here. We'll also see, as we continue with Access, that we can make these queries much more powerful to really pull out information that is relevant to a question we're trying to answer that would be much harder to go through line by line and find. Lastly, these queries can be saved. So I'm going to click the Save button, and I'll just save it as students with GPA over 3. And I'll click OK. Now I can close this query, and if the data changes, if we have a new student, or let's say Mary gets a higher GPA the next semester, when I run the query again, I'm going to double click on it over on the left side. Now Mary's included. So what the query does is it remembers the instructions, how to get the data. I want the first name, last name, and GPA for all students with a GPA greater than 3. And every time I run the query, it opens it up and follows those instructions. So it might get updated data. That means I can create a query once, even if it's a really complicated query. And every time, even if the information has changed, every time I open that query, I get the most up-to-date results. So a query is really helpful even with a simple question like this, because I can save it and get the latest results every time I open that query. So let's look at a few more things we can do with our criteria. I'm going to go back. I've run the query now. I want to go design it. So in the home ribbon, I can click the design button up here and jump back to the design view that we saw before. Let's just look at GPA. I can have a GPA of greater than 3 here. I could ask for students whose GPA is less than 3. I can ask for students whose GPA is exactly 3, and I can either just put the 3 there or put an equal sign. And lastly, I can ask for students whose GPA is greater than or equal to 3, less than or equal to 3, or not equal to 3, and that's the less than greater than sign. You can sort of think of that as a student whose GPA is less than 3 or greater than 3, so basically anything except for 3. We can also do criteria for names, pieces of text like the first name or the last name. So if I'm interested just in Mary, I can put Mary there. I should put quotes around it to tell Access that this is text, but I can just write the name Mary or put an equal sign in front to make it explicit that it should be equal to Mary, but either one will have the same result. When I run the query, I'm now going to get all the students whose name is Mary here, and there's just one in this case. So let's see a few common errors that might happen here. I'll go back and clear this out. One thing that can happen is I'm actually allowed to type in up here the field. I don't have to just choose it from the dropdown. And if I misspell something, so instead of GPA, I just write GP. When I run the query, I get this weird text box up here that says enter parameter value and GP. This is actually Access trying to do something helpful, but in our case it's an error. It's just that we misspelled GPA. This can be really helpful because GP is the thing that it does not recognize. It does not see a GP in our table. And so I can click cancel and look down here in my query for GP, and I find it right here. I want to get rid of this and type GPA. Another thing that can happen is a data mismatch. So GPA is a number. If I say it should be equal to Mary, when I run it, it's going to say there's a data type mismatch. The type of the data, GPA is a number, does not match the criteria type, which is text. So if I get a data type mismatch, typically something in the criteria is not matching whatever field it's underneath. This is text, this is a number, those don't match up. So criteria for a number should always be a number, criteria for text should always be text. One possible situation I might get into is if I close this and save it. What is going on now is there's an error saved into my query. So when I try to open my query, it tries to run the query. By default, it opens it up and runs the query, and it shows me an error message. And it seems like I can't open up my query to fix the error. Every time I double click on it, it just shows me this error message. What I'll need to do is right click and choose design view. So instead of the default opening and running the query, which causes the error, I want to open it in the design view, and there I can go in and fix the error. And now save it or run it so that it shows up correctly.